let's be real. There's a lot of out there as it relates to gardening hacks, tips, and it can be really difficult to separate facts from fiction, especially if you're a beginner. So today, I'm going to share with you 12 tried and true, no BS gardening hacks that have personally worked for me over the years. And best of all, they're going to save you both time and ever feel guilty about throwing away food? Well, why not bury your kitchen scraps to help enrich your soil? What I love about this is that this can be used both in ground and in containers. If you're doing this in ground, one of the benefits of this, one of the many benefits of this, is that it will attract certain decomposers like earthworms. And earthworms, they'll help aerate and loosen the soil, improving your overall soil structure, which is especially beneficial if you have clay soil like me. And as they eat the food, they'll poop, which is black gold and free fertilizer. And in both instances, both in ground and in containers, as the food decomposes, it will release all of its nutrients and minerals back into whatever growing media. I personally prefer to only do this with produce, eggshells, and things like paper towels. However, I know a lot of people will also include meat and bones in the mix. However, I tend to stray away because I've found that meat products tend to most likely attract things like rodents. However, again, personal preference. To bury in ground, you're simply going to dig a trench of about 6 inches deep and just dump your kitchen scraps in. I like to use a shovel to break up the food scraps into smaller pieces. This will help hasten the decomposition process by providing the bacteria and fungi with moist surface area. Then you're just going to cover it up and water it in, and you're done. To use in containers, simply add a thin layer of food scraps at the bottom, and I like to top it off with some type of untreated paper, and then fill with potting mix and water in. The amount of time it takes for full decomposition depends largely on temperature and moisture levels. As you can imagine, the warmer, the faster the process. You also want to make sure the area retains some level of moisture because water also aids decomposition. If you're doing this while it's warm, I'd recommend starting this process at least 8 to 10 weeks ahead of when you're going to be planting in the area. If you're doing this while it's cool, I'd recommend starting this at least 3 to 5 months ahead of when you're going to be planting. And if your ground freezes, it could take up to 6 months for full decomposition. The next tip is to succession plant. So here are my carrots, and these look a little beat up from the freeze we had. We got down to the teens a few weeks ago, but they're doing just fine. But as you can see over here, we have this side, or they're a lot taller and more established, and then as you go down, you can see that they're smaller and smaller, and then you have these like that are just sprouting. So succession planting is a process of just staggering out the time in which you plant seeds or transplant plants in order to extend your harvest. So what I've done as I've been coming in and harvesting carrots from this bed, I've just kind of played like, the seed fairy and sprinkled seeds throughout here of carrots, and you can see quite a bit have germinated. And a lot of people will tell you to actually thin out your carrots. I never do that. I feel like when I thin it out, I always have like a piddly harvest. I just kind of let nature do its thing and the carrots just sort of make way for one another. But that's like my personal preference. Again, do what you do, but I find that it's unnecessary. That's assuming your soil is enriched enough to support all this growth. This next tip is for all of your container plants. Instead of making your drainage holes at the bottom, consider making them about 1 inch up from the bottom on the side. What this does is it creates a water reservoir at the bottom so your plants don't dry out as fast. It reduces a bit of the runoff of nutrients while still allowing the container to drain. There's no denying that pollinators are imperative to a successful garden. So that's why I make it a point to create a habitat for these pollinators within my gardening space. This ensures that when I plant things that need to be pollinated in order to fruit, the pollinators are already here or very close by. That means I don't have to worry about figuring out how to attract them to my garden, and I don't have to worry about doing things like hand pollinating because the pollinators are doing it for me, just as nature intended. A few ways I do this outside of, planting flowers is letting my crops go to flower. This is an example of a broccoli plant that I let go to flower, and you can see there is literally a bee frenzy on this plant. In that same vein, don't be afraid to let your weeds go to flower, which I know can seem counterintuitive, But the flowers of weeds are an important food source for native bees and other native wildlife. And contrary to popular belief, it's the native bees that are actually endangered as opposed to honeybees. When removing plants, instead of pulling it up from the roots, consider cutting them at the base at soil level. The roots naturally aerate and loosen the soil, and as they decompose, they release those nutrients back into the soil. And after I cut the plant to soil level, I'll then cover it up with some soil and mulch. And why not bring things full circle by using plant scraps and weeds you collected around the garden to make your own fertilizer? All you do is gather all your plant material, put it in some type of container, and fill with water. Rainwater is best. And I like to sprinkle in a little bit of compost just to jumpstart the decomposition process. I'll weigh it down with the brick. Whatever you use, you want to make sure it comes with a lid because you do not want to create a breeding ground for mosquitoes. The next tip is to buy local. The problem with big box stores is most times the assortment of plants is for the masses. Rarely do they give consideration to the ideal growing conditions for the plant in relation to where it's actually being shipped. Additionally, you'll find your variety options are quite limited. When buying from a local nursery, not only are you helping your local economy, but they're most likely going to be carrying plants and variety of plants that are proven to do well for your area. And in my experience, the plants just look healthier and are typically cheaper. The next tip is to save your seeds from your plants. Now, this is a hibiscus plant, and I know she's looking a little rough, but in her prime, she was almost 6 feet tall, 10 feet wide, and was quite the looker. I've left her as is because this plant has now become a food source for the native birds. They've been picking at the seeds. So I wanted to come out here and save some seeds before the birds strip this plant bare. Whenever plants perform well within my garden, especially if they're heirloom, meaning if you plant the seeds, they will come up true to the type of plant, I always save the seeds because I know that this plant has become adapted and resilient to my particular microclimate within my garden. If you save seeds from hybrid plants, you don't know what you're getting, but sometimes that is the fun of it. So don't let me discourage you. Also, this saves you money because you only have to buy seeds once and then you have a never-ending supply. The next tip is to use bins and containers to collect rainwater. This is especially useful if you live somewhere where you have periods of drought and have water restrictions. I have these placed all throughout my yard, and it's great for plants that are in areas that are hard to access with the hose. Rainwater is also the best water you can give your plants. It's full of nutrients. And again, make sure whatever container you're using that it has a lid because, again, mosquitoes. We already talked about letting plants go to flower and saving seeds. Another tip is to let plants go to seed for them to reseed themselves, aka plant themselves. This past season, I let a ton of lettuce and herbs just go to seed, and I literally had lettuce growing out of my lawn in my clay soil. I did this with my dill too, and I now know the meaning of dill weed. Before spending money on containers, stop by your local nursery and see if they have any containers that they're going to throw out and they're willing to give away. I have a bunch of these 40-gallon containers that I got for free by just going to my nursery and asking, and they gave them to me. The next tip is to plant your groceries. Now, admittedly, there is a lot of crap out there in terms of kitchen scraps and being able to grow things and things you can grow from the grocery store. But surprisingly, some of it's actually true. And I know this from my own personal experience. For example, I've only ever grown ginger and turmeric from what I've gotten from the grocery store. Additionally, every year I start my sweet potato slips from store-bought sweet potatoes. If you would like me to do a video showing how I start plants from produce from the grocery store, let me know in the comments below. If you are going to be doing this, I highly recommend using organic produce because it's not uncommon for conventional produce to be sprayed with things like growth inhibitors as well as hormones that, inhibit growth. Here's a list of produce that I've gotten from the grocery store and have had luck in the past with planting and growing in my garden. I hope you found today's tips useful. And remember, gardening is all about trial and error and trying new things. It's kind of like my Nana used to always say, which the fact that I'm about to quote my grandma makes me feel old. But she used to say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And even if I say it out loud, even today sounds pretty morbid. But it means is that there's more than one way to do something. What works for me or someone else may not work for you, and vice versa. And that's okay. Experiment. Share your learnings. We all just trying to eat. But y'all already know the deal. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And remember, every black thumb ripens to green, and it all just starts with a seed.